For decades, global mobility followed an unspoken rule. Washington decided, and the rest of the world adapted. Visas were denied, borders tightened, and entire nations quietly absorbed the consequences. That rhythm broke in late December 2025. When the Trump administration expanded US visa restrictions to include Mali and Burkina Faso, the response was expected: silence, protests, then compliance. Instead, both West African states responded with calm defiance, imposing reciprocal travel bans on US citizens. No outrage, no grandstanding, just law, logic, and principle. This wasn't symbolism, it was reciprocity, rarely exercised by nations long placed at the receiving end of visa power. For Africans at home and across the diaspora, the moment carried deeper meaning. It signaled a shift in posture, a refusal to accept automatic subordination in global mobility. What looked like routine immigration policy in Washington became, in Africa, a quiet geopolitical rupture. And it raises a question the world isn't used to asking. What happens when the restricted finally respond? In Washington, the ban was described as technical, even preventative. In Bamako and Ouagadougou, it felt like a verdict, not against governments, but against people. Whole populations were suddenly placed under suspicion. No distinction between students and soldiers, professionals and families. Just one blunt message: those we cannot fully control cannot be trusted. Yet what followed is what made this moment different. Many countries have appeared on such lists before. Most protested quietly, then adjusted. Mali and Burkina Faso did not. Within days, official statements emerged, measured, legal, emotionless, repeating a single principle with precision: reciprocity. If Malian and Burkina citizens were barred from the United States, then US citizens would be barred from their countries. Same logic, same treatment. For American passport holders used to near-universal access, the shock ran deeper than inconvenience. It disrupted an assumption that mobility flows only one way. For Africans at home and across the diaspora, it hinted at something larger: a refusal to accept global hierarchies as permanent. Borders, legitimacy, and leverage, long dominated by the West, were suddenly being answered with symmetry. And that quiet defiance raised an uncomfortable question. What changed so profoundly that silence was no longer an option? From Washington's perspective, the logic was simple. America was under threat, borders were vulnerable, and caution had to outweigh convenience. In that framework, adding Mali and Burkina Faso to a growing list of restricted countries felt routine. Both face insecurity. Both are led by military governments. Both have stepped away from Western-backed regional systems. On paper, they fit the profile. But in Bamako and Ouagadougou, the message landed differently. What the US framed as a technical security measure was read as a political judgment. No individuals named, no reforms offered, no path back. Entire populations were placed behind a wall, labeled suspect by default. Instability, the message implied, equals exclusion, and exclusion requires no dialogue. That sense of finality changed everything. Coming at a moment when both countries were already redefining their alliances and rejecting Western double standards, the ban felt less neutral and more confirmatory. Silence this time would have meant accepting a permanent downgrade. And that, for governments shaped by years of broken security promises and public disillusionment, was no longer acceptable. The juntas justified their takeovers with one central claim: the old security model, especially under external supervision, had failed. That context matters. Because when Washington imposed a blanket travel ban, it did more than restrict movement. It assigned blame. Not to policies or institutions, but to people. Students, professionals, families, officials, everyone folded into a single risk category. No individual review, no benchmarks for improvement, no signal that cooperation could change anything. In Bamako and Ouagadougou, the message was stark. You are the problem, and no explanation is owed. In another era, that decision might have been absorbed. Formal protests, quiet diplomacy, then acceptance. But these are not ordinary times. Mali and Burkina Faso's leaders came to power rejecting the idea that legitimacy flows from Western approval. Accepting a collective ban without response would have undercut everything they claimed to represent. So they chose reciprocity. Not outrage, not symbolism. Principle. Reciprocity did what protests never do. It erased hierarchy. Calm, legal statements replaced angry rhetoric, and suddenly exclusion was no longer one-sided. The discomfort shifted. American passport holders felt the friction. Visa power, long invisible and unequal, became mutual. That is why silence was no longer an option. For decades, American passport holders moved through West Africa with little friction. Aid workers, diplomats, journalists, access was assumed, rarely questioned. That quiet privilege created influence without formal control. Reciprocity shattered that assumption overnight. Entry was no longer automatic. Presence now required permission. For the first time, American nationals felt the uncertainty long familiar to citizens of weaker states. This was deliberate. Reciprocity allowed Mali and Burkina Faso to make a simple point. If mobility is a privilege, it must be mutual. By mirroring US policy, they exposed the imbalance of visa power without resorting to anger. The ban was not retaliation. It was logic applied in reverse. Negotiation made little sense. The US ban offered no benchmarks, no reforms, no path back, only exclusion. Responding in kind signaled finality, not pleading. Domestically, it reinforced credibility. Internationally, it sent a wider message. Sovereignty does not stop at the airport gate, and access is no longer a one-way decision. There is no denying that Mali and Burkina Faso face brutal armed violence. Entire regions have been destabilized, civilians displaced, and attacks persist. On paper, Washington's argument sounds logical. Instability creates risk, and risk demands caution. But in Bamako and Ouagadougou, that logic falters once a harder question is asked: who oversaw the period when that instability exploded? For more than a decade, both countries operated within Western-designed security frameworks. Foreign troops, intelligence sharing, training missions were presented as solutions. Yet, during that same era, armed groups multiplied, spread, and entrenched themselves. Rural control collapsed, public trust eroded, and anger grew, conditions that paved the way for military takeovers. That history matters. To Sahelian leaders, the US visa ban feels less like protection and more like blame shifted downward. It targets civilians, not militants. Students, families, professionals, people with no role in violence, are punished for conditions they did not create. If insecurity is the justification, why are those living under it treated as suspects rather than partners? By responding with reciprocity, Mali and Burkina Faso avoided moral outrage and exposed a deeper question. Is this really about security, or is it disengagement disguised as caution? Because true security policy offers dialogue, benchmarks, and pathways forward. This one offered only distance, and distance changes the balance of leverage. Until now, US-Sahel relations rested on an unspoken rule. Washington decided, West African states adjusted. Even when policies were unpopular, responses stayed contained. Formal statements, quiet resentment, diplomatic notes. Mali and Burkina Faso broke that pattern. They showed that unilateral decisions will now invite unilateral consequences. This does not mean the United States has lost power. It still holds leverage through aid, finance, sanctions, and diplomacy. But power also depends on predictability, and that is what this moment disrupted. By responding quickly and symmetrically, Bamako and Ouagadougou signaled that future US actions will no longer be cost-free. Even if the material impact is limited, the psychological shift is significant. The timing matters. The Sahel is already drifting away from Western-centered frameworks. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have loosened traditional ties and explored alternative alignments. In that context, the visa ban did not isolate them. It reinforced a path already chosen. For Washington, every option now carries a cost. Reversal looks weak. Escalation accelerates disengagement. Ignoring the response confirms imbalance. This episode matters because it marks a shift from managed tension to mutual friction. A psychological line has been crossed, and others are watching closely, asking a dangerous question. If reciprocity is possible, why stay silent next time?